The proposal of the European Commission goes some way in the direction of shifting funds to those new priorities, but we think that shift should be much bigger than it currently is. Let me mention a couple of priorities that we think the EU should focus more on. One is security. Now, you may know that the Netherlands is a member of NATO, the military alliance, in which the US and Canada are also allies, and most of the EU countries are. So that's our first and foremost cornerstone when it comes to security. But the European Union itself could do more as well. We have soft power instruments helping through development cooperation and emergency aid in the area around us, North Africa and the Middle East. But also in the military sphere, we could do much more. For one thing, and this is one case where we agree with President Trump, the Europeans could spend more money on a national basis on defense. But their cooperation could also be much better. We've got 27 states with 27 different sets of priorities when it comes to new stuff, when it comes to investing in research, which is defense related. And there is another issue as well. We don't really cooperate when it comes to moving military units from one country to another. Of course, when you've got a gun and you've got munitions, those are dangerous stuffs. And before you can get them across national borders, you have a customs check. So you can imagine if you want to move stuff from the Netherlands to Poland, for example, that takes a lot of time. And we think one of the things that we should improve is that kind of inflexibility. We call it the military highway, military mobility, if you want. Migration is another issue which needs much more of an emphasis than we are giving it today, and also on a structural basis. We've been reacting to crises. The crisis presented itself, and then all of a sudden we had to find a solution. So it was haphazard, it was making it up as we went along, with all the results that you could see on your television each and every day. Now we found some sort of interim solution. Refugee flows have become quite small, but the problems in North Africa and in the Middle East still exist, and we can expect another crisis to erupt, and Europe has to be ready for that. So we have to agree in advance, how are we going to deal with that kind of strategy? Where are the responsibilities of each and every state? Because that was an issue. You may have noticed that some European countries simply refused to let in refugees from Muslim countries. We should have a common European asylum system, agreeing where asylum seekers who are accepted should be first accommodated and how we should distribute them over Europe. This relocation of refugees across Europe remains a difficult issue, again because not all countries are willing to do their share. And here we think that the gentle pressure through financial means should also play a role. If you don't want to carry the burden, then perhaps you shouldn't have the money. It's not just one-way solidarity. We have to share the burden. I already mentioned climate policy, which will need a lot of investment, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. When I listen to the New Zealand Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, he voices exactly what we are saying. Climate change is a #1 priority, and 2, investments in technology to combat climate change or to prevent CO2 emissions from getting worse, or perhaps even pushing them back, they are not just sunk costs, they are investments. You can develop technologies which you can then apply elsewhere. And most major companies in Europe as well expect that this green economy will generate economic growth. So it's not just subsidizing and giving away money, it will generate new sectors which in themselves will become economically productive. A few of the new priorities, but we think these are the 21st century challenges which need much more money from the EU budget than the old style sectors, agriculture and cohesion fund are getting. So perhaps you expect us to be in favor of a larger EU budget, but I can tell you this is not the case. We think right now it's about 1% of European gross national product goes to the EU budget, and that's sufficient. And here we've got a problem with the Commission, but the Commission wants to raise the budget by 13% in all. Actually, the European Parliament is even more ambitious because they've been talking about 40% more. And we say no, same level, even after the Brits have left, and they are good for about 10 to 15% of the EU budget. So you can see new priorities cannot be financed out of a smaller budget. So that's why one of the reasons why we say we should have a shift of funding from those huge sectors, 75% of the budget, to other more prioritized issues. Not everyone agrees with us, obviously. The countries which profit from flows of money from Brussels will not agree. The Commission itself wants to have more money. Parliament wants to have more money. So we are in for a big fight there. But there's a number of countries which feel like us, Germany, for example, or the other 7 countries which signed together with us that joint declaration that I mentioned before. There is another issue, which is the fact that the Netherlands is a net contributor to the European Union budget. Obviously, we pay in, but we get support back as well. But overall, we pay a lot more than we get back. In principle, that is not at all a problem, because we are one of the richest EU countries, one of the wealthiest. But there should be some reasonable distribution of this net contribution. So we would like to have a good look at what everybody is getting and what everybody is paying, so that countries with the same level of prosperity have the same level of net contribution. No disproportionate contributions. And in the initial reactions to the proposal by the Commission, I could see that this was one of the elements which was lacking from that proposal. And I can tell you that not just the Eurosceptical parties in the Dutch Parliament, but most of the other parties as well, are firmly on the side of the government in this particular thing. It also means pressure on the government. You have to go to Brussels and make sure you get a good deal, a fair share out of the negotiations. So there's 2 things each and every government has to do: negotiate in Brussels and negotiate at home. It makes for a very complicated and interesting negotiating environment. One thing I think I already mentioned, the proposal we have to link the EU budget to efforts to encourage member states to carry out the agreed on reforms and modernization of their economies. We find that in the new Commission proposal. That's what we are happy about. The big thing, of course, will be how are we going to develop a mechanism through which we can monitor that this is actually taking place. And a final linkage, or conditionality, if you will. I already mentioned funding to action on migration. We should link, we think, European funding of programs in member states to their willingness to take on their share of the migration burden. But there is another conditionality as well. As you know, there are some countries in the European Union where there are developments with regard to the independence of the judiciary or the freedom of the press, which we feel and which the Commission feels are not in line with European values and norms, with the acquis communautaire which these member states took upon themselves when they joined the Union, the promise that rules and regulation with regard to democracy, rule of law, human rights, etc., would be taken on fully. It's in the press, or you all know about the, let's call it the negotiation between the Commission and Poland in this regard. We are fully behind European Commissioner Frans Timmermans, not just because he's a Dutchman, but because we feel intrinsically he is right, and because intrinsically this has to do with the core of the European Union. Because like I said, we are a community of values and not just a common market. We stand for something. And that's also actually the reason why the formerly communist countries wanted to join the European Union. It was not just money, it was not just security, it was also because it's a community of values. Now it's important that we all stick to those European values, because otherwise Europe will lose its soul. And if we have to use financial levers to get there in the ultimate case, then we should be willing to use them. And I think we can find that in the European Commission proposal as well. So, in short, I've given you some of the overviews, an overview of some of the principles and concrete actions that we think are necessary today. I've given some reaction already to the European Commission proposal. I think a lot needs to be done in that regard. We've got 2 years of negotiations ahead, but it all has to do with the future of Europe. What kind of Europe do we want? In which direction should it go? Not just commercially, but also legally, and as far as norms and values are concerned. So we are in a crucial phase of European Union development. We are at this particular crossroads, and the choices over the next 2 years will be important for the entire continent. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.